forward to this talk. It should be very good. Oh, okay. Thank you, Gary. Ah, there he is. He's just coming up. I see connecting to audio coming. Okay, David, we're ready from you. I don't think I can talk to your ham radio career, and I think you could do that better than I will. So, David, why don't you go ahead and take it over. And to DJE to take it. WB2IKT and the Zoom gang. Go ahead, Dave. Yeah, he's on. Okay, let's hear your audio. Gary, you hearing him?
No, he has to unmute himself.
There we go. Okay.
That's
How's
better.
that?
Oh,
Much
terrific.
better.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Sorry, I had my times crossed up a little bit, but we're good to go at this point. My ham radio experience goes back, I'd say, quite a ways. Presently, I'm licensed as N2DJE. I was first licensed as W82UWK back in high school, Ward Millville High School, which had a very active amateur radio club. And that's kind of what got me rolling on the whole ham thing. I stayed WA2UWK for a couple of years. I think I upgraded a couple of times, went from novice to technician to general. I think I went to N2DJE as a general back in the late 80s. And then became, and then picked up once they did away with the code requirement, I got into 13 words a minute for the general, but the prospect of me getting to 20 was not very good. But when the code requirement went away, I went and got my extra. But kept N2DJE. I'm probably more of a hands-on electronics guy than a super active operator. Did do a lot of work on repeaters and such. What the big thing that got me going in high school was there was a repeater at the high school. It was affiliated with the high school amateur radio club. Got a lot of old, GE and Motorola stuff resurrected and running. And in fact, the legacy of that repeater lives on. It's actually the same 146-3494 pair is still up and running. It's I sort of brought it along to Symbol, then Zebra, then Motorola, then Zebra, where I work. So that 2-meter repair is still active and has been with me for quite a while. That's it in a brief nutshell. Spent a lot of time on 2 meters. I don't get on HF as much as I'd like to. We do a big amateur radio. We do a club field day each year at the Zebra facility in Holtzville. That's probably my single biggest activity for the year. But that kind of gives you a little bit of background. I'll go a little bit more into some of my other activities as I get the presentation rolling. How's that for getting started? All right, let me share my screen. If there's nothing else you want to do ahead of time, I'll share my screen, and hopefully this works. I'm not used to Zoom. I'm not a Zoom person. Okay. Is the sharing working?
Yes, just put it into full screen slideshow mode.
Sure.
Beautiful.
And
seeing your notes. Yeah.
Yeah. It always wants to. That issue I'm familiar with.
There you go.
Let me get that out of the way. Okay. There we go. So a little bit of background. Radio Central went on the air November 5th of 1921. So in anticipation of the 100th anniversary, there was actually some work going on with the IEEE to get Radio Central designated an IEEE, as they call it, monument. We never thought it would all come together at the right time, but it did. We were actually ready to do the IEEE monument thing pre-COVID. So the thinking was we would we would get that done well ahead, but COVID conspired against us, and it didn't end up happening serendipitously until exactly the 100th anniversary to the day. So there was a ceremony. There was a plaque installed actually at the high school, Rocky Point High School, commemorating the, Rocky Point, what took place there. And I prepared this slide deck for that event. There was a luncheon held out there, probably something on the order of 100 people. And I gave this slide presentation. It's not super technical. We can segue to some of the technical discussions as we go through it. I assume I can still hear everybody's audio. Not if you have any questions, just shout them out, and I'll do my best to answer them. All right. Okay. Why isn't this? There we go. Okay. So a little bit about me and my story that the ham radio stuff adds to it. But so my father, Robert Lundquist, as I say there in the first bullet, he was a station engineer out there from 67 to I think roughly 74 is when things really started to wind down. So I was born in 62, so that put me in I was a young kid. So as I say there, I spent many Saturdays at Rocky Point kind of soaking up the RF energy and probably not fully appreciating what was going on around me. Not fully, but I thought it was a cool place to go. Did take let me switch to okay. Did take a class trip there in 4th grade, and it was cool to take everybody that I knew from school to where my dad worked. Ironically, my father, he attended a private school in Stony Brook growing up, and he actually attended an event there in the 40s. Probably, yeah, during the war, he was at the Stony Brook School. So history repeated itself. As noted, I'm a reasonably active amateur into DJE. I did pick up an FCC commercial license along the way. Funny story there. I've never really used it, but when my father left RCA, he was with Brookhaven Cable TV for many years, or what later became Cablevision. And he encouraged one of the guys who worked there to get his radio telephone license. So I said, "Oh, my son's going to college for engineering. Why don't you do it with him?" So I took the opportunity to do that. With the radio bug when it bit me, it altered my career aspirations. So I ended up doing a bachelor's in electrical engineering at SUNY Stony Brook, which is very close to where I grew up. As George Sullivan knows, I did my master's at Polytech, and he and I crossed paths as he was an instructor in the data and computer communications class that I took. So long-term IEEE member. New York State did my PE license at one point. That was an interesting exercise. And I currently work at Zebra Technologies, where I work in the what they call the mobile computing division. If you've seen some of the handheld mobile computers that some of the delivery companies use, Amazon uses them, FedEx is one of our customers, Target, you name it. We sell to a lot of those guys. And I've been there through 3 name changes. It was Symbol Technologies when I started. Changed to Motorola when they acquired us. Motorola unacquired us when Zebra acquired us. So it's been an interesting ride. Been pretty much a hands-on development guy the whole way. Okay. So just a little kickoff of what led RCA to end up in Rocky Point. And it's a bit out of the ordinary. That first paragraph, RCA, the interesting point was that most of the wireless communications in the world were run by companies that were not US companies. And this was seen as a national security threat, essentially. As a note there, second paragraph, primarily it was the Marconi Wireless Company in the US, which is a subsidiary of the Marconi was actually a British company. So as we note there, in order to keep the technology in American hands, GE took over Marconi. And it was, like I said, it was actually a government-funded exercise. So RCA was really a government-founded corporation. And not too long after it was founded, they, as we see there at the end, they wanted to provide worldwide service and build this quote-unquote Radio Central transmitter at Rocky Point, together with the receiving station at Riverhead. And of course, this was all managed out of New York City. We'll talk a little bit more about how that all works. So I can give you I can supply copies of Mort's thing. It was in the IEEE magazine. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me sharing. Okay, this one I used this shot at a patent presentation. I among other things at Zebra, I chair the patent committee for our business. And, you know, there's this perception that technology is only moving quickly today. It's not true. As we'll see, the technology was moving very rapidly, actually, as Radio Central was, even when it was built. As I often say, that it was becoming obsolete before the concrete was hard. And I'll explain why as we progress. But that's what the site looks today. That's from Google Maps. There's not a lot left of it. It's just primarily the roads around the building. Cooling ponds were here. You'll see in some of the later pictures. Main building was right where this brown patch is. And there was all, you know, a variety of telephone poles, antennas, etc., surrounding the building. Okay. This is an artist's rendering of what the concept was supposed to be. Obviously, well, this is an aerial representation. We're looking west towards New York City. Got the North Shore of the island on the right. This is Rocky Point here. At the center of these spokes of the wheel is where the main building would be, was planned to be, and it was. And then you see these radiating spokes of antennas, which were, well, only 2 of these were eventually constructed. I forgot exactly which ones they were, but only 2 rows. So as I said, it before the concrete was hard, it was actually the concept kind of ran out of steam. So what was the concept? This is actually an interesting diagram. As actually, I think there weren't even originally 12. There was actually 11 if you look at some of the maps. But again, they never got past 2 of these wings, as they call them. They were planning a whole series of 10 200 kilowatt alternators. You'll note that these countries are shown. We'll get into what the antenna structure was a little bit later, but it's not clear how much directivity was available out of these antenna structures. So I don't quite understand how they got to the countries based on the locations of the compass points and such, but worth looking at. There's some interesting combinations of alternators. You'll see, for example, here they show 2 alternators feeding 3 antennas. Again, this all never came to be. This was all just a paper exercise. And then there was even this concept where they could drive all the antennas in parallel with about a megawatt of total power for emergency broadcast conditions. So it's important to note, okay, the guy who, if you go back to, if you said who created what's at Rocky Point, it's really this guy, Ernst Frederick Werner Alexanderson. Again, he's the guy who was chiefly responsible for the technology, how this was all put together that was used at Rocky Point. This included the alternators, and by way of explaining, you know, this was pre-large vacuum tube transmitters. This wasn't spark gap. This was all AC alternator based, just a much higher frequency version of what generates our electrical power today, or the voltage in your car. But instead of a few hundred, 60 hertz or 120 hertz or 50 hertz. It was around 18 kilohertz. A very, very low frequency, just barely above the audible range. You'll see later in some of the logbooks, it was all the stuff was sub 20 kilohertz. He holds several key patents on the technology. Guys like Tesla get a lot of credit, what they did. Alex Anderson, if you look at total number of patents, is not far behind Tesla. And he was continuing to generate intellectual property up until the 60s. He did a lot of patenting on television, aircraft navigation systems, you name it. He's an extremely prolific inventor. And he was, as impressive as what he did at Rocky Point was, he was really just getting started with what he did during this era. Not going to go too much into exactly what goes on here, but it's worth sharing this. This was just one of the pivotal patents that he filed that's related to what existed at Rocky Point. And what's worth mentioning, and I myself was completely misguided on exactly what was going on there. When you look at that central building and those long antennas strung out over numerous towers, six towers per antenna, the natural assumption is it's some sort of, well, is it a dipole? Is it a quarter wave? What is it? Well, won't go into the math here, but it's not a half-wave dipole. Despite the scale that you saw on that map, at the frequencies involved, 18 kilohertz or so, those antennas are not even, they're not nearly long enough to be resonant. And what the antenna really is it's a vertical. It don't look like a vertical, but it's a vertical. In that, you've got this multi-wire capacitive hat, essentially, spread out over a long distance. You've got tuned inductive vertical wires. And what you can see is that the alternator feeds this whole large horizontal array through a step-up transformer. And there is a extensive buried wire counterpoise in the ground. So it's not what it would first appear on by first inspection. You'd think it's a dipole or some kind of infed long wire. They're not. Any questions or comments there? We can cover things later if you want to. Take questions anytime. But it's worth going. The patents really were the best way to understand exactly how this operates. Okay. All right, we're gonna, again, what I've got put together here was really more for a historical group. So there's some pretty heavy just picture content. We'll go through some of the stuff. It's certainly of interest, and maybe there's technical elements as we go through. So the company that constructed the place, J.G. White, they took a lot of pictures. This is actually, well, this is the main building. Eventually, the front door is right here. The big excavation in front here is the cooling pond. Now, these alternators, and they were planned to be a lot of them, 200 kilowatts each. They required cooling, and water cooling was the preferred method. So there was a large, they call it a pond. It really was a pool, I guess, because it was a concrete lined facility in front of the building. And they even had means to spray the water up in the air in case the water got too hot in the summer. But that's what you're looking at here. This is what will eventually become the main building. Now, it got expanded on either end as time went on, but the central core of the building is what's seen here. And you'll notice, I mean, one of the advantages of doing this kind of stuff on Long Island is look at the soil. It's all just sand, right? Very easy to bury your counterpoise wires in this soil. Not much in the way of rocks. This, I guess, shortly thereafter, they put dates on everything. You'll notice this is August 12th to 21. So, the place was open 3 months later. So they got a lot of work done quickly. It's not the neatest construction site I've ever seen. There's a fair amount of stuff laying here. But even the cooling pond, you can see they did in sections. It got wider as time went on. But you can already see they've got some of the main towers up in the background. And again, there was a row out the back of the building. And this picture was taken from the first tower that led on the antenna wing out the front of the building. And in fact, the tower that this was obviously taken from was the last one that came down in the 70s. So that one was up for a long time. Some of the buildings are interesting. Not too much interesting from a radio standpoint. You can imagine in 1921, Rocky Point was a pretty desolate, empty place. So RCA constructed their own hotel right on the building, right on the property. It was for those familiar with the area. It was just on the south side of 25A, a little bit west of Rocky Point Road. It's all, again, all the land eventually went to the state of New York. So there's actually a trail, a hiking trail called the Palmanook Path Trailhead. And if you see where that is on 25A, that's actually where this building was. It was called the Community House. There were also, I just put a couple of these up there, there were on the same property, a couple of cottages for senior level folks. At one point when the place was shut down, my father, who's sort of tending to the property for RCA, these places were actually sold for not much money, but a house moving guy came along and picked them up and moved at least two of them, and two of them are on the South Fork of Long Island someplace. But there were 4 cottages and the community center that were kind of like a on-site village, if you will. All right, then I've got a bunch of interesting pictures about the towers going up. Anybody who's put up a tower can appreciate the scale of this and what was involved. This is I guess much earlier that year. It looks like the towers were actually some of the first stuff to go up. This is March of 1921. These concrete bases, I mean, they're still there. They were there as, I know one of the clubs, I think actually the Radio Central Club, did field day on site for quite a while. And I went back there maybe 10, 15 years ago. And where that one tower is in front of the main building, I don't know how deep these concrete forms go, but given that the tower weighed a couple 100 tons, there was a fair amount of concrete there. They'll be there for a long time. Again, if anybody has any, this is some interesting stuff. We don't know where this was. This was probably the construction crew at one point for the site. I guess everybody, we were trying to get the Historical Society to see if they could identify the house, but no answers. This gives you some idea of the construction effort involved. The company that put up the towers, I think, was actually called the American Bridge Corporation. So this is what these guys did for a living. And it's, as you notice, he's got a real serious hard hat there going on, and there's little or no safety gears, no harnesses, no nothing. But not aware of any unfortunate incidents on site, but who knows? This gives you, well, this is interesting, and I think there's some more pictures of this. This is actually part of a gin pole, if you will, that they used to bring up pieces of the tower. They would anchor this at different levels and use cables and use it almost as a crane to lift up sections of the tower. And as I said, keep in mind the photographer had to get up here too. So. I mentioned there's a lot of copper that went into the ground. From what I can see, given the structure of the antennas, for every piece of copper that was up in the air, there was a complementary piece of copper in the ground. And very likely all of it's still there. I don't know how deep they buried it. There was a piece of equipment I think I've got a picture of, which shows a pullable device, 4 wheels, pulled by a tractor, that cut what looks like about a 12-inch deep furrow in the ground and dropped the wire in. I guess copper wasn't terribly expensive at that point. That's the company dog, I guess. He deserved a picture all his own. Okay, this gives you some idea of the scale of things. This is both sets of towers. This was clearly taken from one end. So you've got, and they were slightly offset. You can see that the main building's down here somewhere. I believe there were 6 towers per row. Yeah, 12 400-foot towers. So each they went 6 towers in each direction from the main building. What's sort of interesting, I guess, efficiency was important back then too. 400-foot towers. The end towers were 142 tons because I guess they had unequal stress on them due to all the wires pulling them in one direction, whereas the intermediate towers had no pull. So what did they saved 12 tons of steel on the intermediate towers. Yeah, designed and fabricated and erected by the American Bridge Company. See anything else noteworthy? It was, yeah, you can see the interesting note here. The lower stuff, the lower section, lower 250 foot were painted. The upper 150 foot was galvanized. Not sure of the logic there. I guess they could find somebody who'd climb 250 feet to paint, but not over. And I guess somewhere along here, that's where the things changed. There were, of course, the lights on the tower. And my father said he climbed it once. There was a strike when most of the guys were out, but and they had to climb it and change the bulbs and just the one tower that remained. The cross arms were, well, most of the towers came down in the 40s. The cross arms were removed though later on, and even the tower close to building 1. There was just a big light at the top. They actually used it, the remaining tower, for microwave traffic. So ironic, it went from, supporting antennas radiating at sub 20 kilohertz to some number of gigahertz later on. It's another shot at it. It kind of gives you a view of the, it's not even clear if this picture was doctored at one point. One of my big conundrums is that you'll notice at each end here, the wires go down to the building. This must have been enhanced in some way. And it seems to go down to the ground at the far end, which is, well, the far end from the building, which is close to us. What we don't see is what's shown in the patent is multiple intermediate wires to ground. I suspect that this picture was augmented manually and they just missed them. But this gives you a pretty good shot of what the overall thing looked like. Okay. This just happened to be one of the, we believe this is what was in Rocky Point. Today the railroad stops at Port Jeff. It used to go much further. There was a Rocky Point train station, and we believe most of the material probably came out via rail. The roads were not really conducive to super heavy loads at that point in time. Again, this is August. This goes back even further. This is August of 1920. This may have even predated the work on the building, on the construction. Okay, so let's talk about on the air. This is interesting. This is actually, and I have it sitting up right here above my desk. They kept, like any good radio station, they kept detailed logbooks. This is actually from the first day of operation. So this was day one when it officially went on the air. But what I'll notice, there was test logs going back over a month prior. So it was the official opening, but it certainly wasn't the first day on the air. Just some read through on what's going on here. Obviously, like any good logbook, they've got the time, got weather. Now here's where things get interesting. If you look here, they've got antenna feed current. We're talking, I guess maybe didn't measure it that often, but the feed current is around 100 amps. A lot of current. Total antenna current, though, is 600 amps. Again, this is a resonant structure, so the circulating currents, and I believe that explains the difference, the magnifying effect. You got a high Q parallel LC circuit. You've got very high circulating currents, much higher than the current feeding the antenna. You've got some antenna field currents. This is essentially, I believe, regulating the actual power that the station is generating. Amplifier control current, I don't know too much about exactly what that's doing. But it is what it is. Motor speed. Now, keep in mind, this is an alternator-based transmitter. So what it really is, it's an AC synchronous motor running off the AC line that's then geared up and drives an alternator, which produces the 18 kilohertz or so radiated signal. And then finally, you got some notes about what's going on here. I don't quite make out the first one. Second one says retuned BSSVs. Now, BS is not, you know what, it's actually, as I said, everything at Rocky Point, unless they were doing testing, the keying, the Morse code that is, all came from Manhattan. Broad Street was where RCA was located. So when you see BS in these logbooks, that's what they mean. Although, as you can see, they can do some local testing too. And some comments here. What's somewhat strange is there's no specific mention here in the logbook from Rocky Point. It might be this 8 a.m. control okay. I don't know. They spent a lot of time retuning, that's for sure. But probably somewhere in here with some of the official initial transmissions from Rocky Point, where they went on the air and the president even gave a speech and allegedly triggered I don't know how it was triggered, but triggered the actual initial first official message from Rocky Point. Again, questions or comments, just shout them out anytime. I don't know if I can hear you folks. I should be able to hear you folks. Somebody give me a yell just to see if I can hear anything. No, I'm not hearing anybody. I'm not sure why. Let me do something here.
No, I got you here if you hear me.
I hear you now. Let me just try that again.
This is W3NRN. Do you copy?
We do copy. Let me go. It seemed like when I went full screen, I lost audio. Do you still hear me?
I still copy.
Perfect. Okay. I was getting worried there. I feel like I'm talking to the wall. One of the disadvantages of remote presentations. Okay. Sounds good. Any questions here on this one? All right, let's keep going. This was just some notes on the back. Again, this was on the back of that sheet we just saw, that logbook page. Again, they seem to do a lot of tuning. There was a lot of problems with wind and such that they had some equipment problems. Circulating pumps, I believe, were the water pumps we talked about earlier.
Oh,
Comment?
yeah, Dave, do you hear us? This is
Yes, we do.
Levittown Hall. Question, I see you guys are transmitting from this station, but how do you know your intended recipient is getting the message?
We'll get to that. That's a great question. Yes,
Marvelous.
that's
Okay. We'll wait.
absolutely, absolutely. So you can see some of the problems they had. You know, clearly it was a very finicky setup. I was a little surprised to see this. It seemed like it was extremely weather, subject to weather conditions and wind and such. My assumption is just that the tuned Q of the overall antenna structure was pretty high, and that any wires swaying in the wind might have changed the effective capacitance or inductance and thus the tuning. So anyway, let's move on. And you may have asked that question. Okay, I've got some pictures of what's going on inside the building. And it doesn't really look like a radio transmitting station. I think the next picture is even better, but this is 2 days after the station opened. It shows just some of the general equipment inside the building. This stuff is all power feed and control stuff for the alternators. This is 2 alternators back to back. And just, for some detail here, these are the actual drive motors. So, this was taking power from the power company at 60 hertz. There was a fairly sophisticated step-up gearbox here. And then that drove this large circular thing. There's 2 of them here, right? This is the actual alternator. And then I'm guessing, see, like this stuff, I think this is where the actual feed came out of the alternator. And it went over, there's some feed networks over it. This is actually, I think it's shown in the next picture. This is actually a large inductor. It's monstrous. This is part of the coupling stuff that coupled the alternator output to the antennas. I believe one of the reasons they ran 2 of these back to back like this is so they could quickly swap alternators if necessary. So by putting the outputs close together, they could probably swing a connection easily between either of the alternators if they should have to switch to a hot spare. Okay. Yeah, this is a much better picture. This, I believe, is essentially looking the other direction. I think the power stuff is now behind us over here on the right. You can clearly see the 2 back-to-back alternators. You can see this guy for scale.
Okay, we have another question here.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, and the question is, you're keying this thing with Morse code,
Yes.
which essentially means you're somehow or other you're turning off on and off at a somewhat rapid rate, hundreds of kilowatts of energy coming out of this thing.
Yes.
My question is, how quickly can you transmit based on rise and fall times through all these high Q circuits?
Well, if we said the circuits were high Q at 18 kilohertz, that's still, what's high Q? Q of 50, something like that. Let's make it easy. Let's say it's 100. You're still at 180 hertz effective, time constant. So there should be no problem with anything, human keyed, because obviously there was no way to mechanical key it here in these days. Probably 35, 40 words a minute, no problem. I'm pretty sure they ran at least those speeds.
I'm just envisioning this Morse code key that resembles a knife switch.
I think through the use of what's called magnetic amplifiers, they were able to key it. Remember, the keying most of the time was not even on site. It came out on essentially telegraph lines from the city. So it's doable. It's doable. They definitely did. I don't have anything at my fingertips, but I'm pretty sure they were at least in the 40 word per minute range. Keep in mind, this monstrous facility and all this infrastructure was basically to transmit one CW signal. So each one of those words was very precious when it came to, dollar value. I'll try to get more info. That's a good question, but I know they were. In fact, I think if you look at some of Alexanderson's patents, it talks about that. In fact, that might be some of the most interesting pieces of what he did, was how they managed to control the transfer power. All right. Sorry, I don't have a crisp answer to that one. But just getting back to where we were, you got the two alternators. You've got, and I think the feed goes straight maybe through this opening into all this tuning stuff here, which I would want to make sure nobody accidentally walked into. Hence the cages. I think these might be some of the pumps for the cooling and stuff, but pretty impressive arrangement. Okay. This outdoor tuning coils, and this I believe this may actually be the transformer that steps up to the antenna. It's likely a tapped inductor, air core tapped inductor. I mean, just look at compared to the scale of the guy standing here. Biggest inductor I've ever seen. And it's on a concrete base. And I put this in here because for many years at Rocky Point, I found these bases, and they're hollow with like kind of a concrete shelf and a bunch of studs sticking out of them around the perimeter. I never could figure out what they were, because all that's left, of course, is the concrete base. But that's what it is. It's part of the matching and coupling network to go up to the antennas. But again, all that remains is the little bits of concrete. It's just an interesting historical photo of this guy sitting here, I guess, doing his job. It's probably a pretty pleasant way to work out in the field. Gives you the idea what Eastern Long Island looked like back in those days, too. This one always gets a laugh. Yes, RCA had their own airplane, and we're heading towards the receiving part of this whole thing. Because the antennas was so big, both receive and transmit, to do any kind of radiated pattern testing, you needed miles and miles of separation. And that's what the airplane was for. I mean, that's how much value there was in this infrastructure, that it was worth investing in an aircraft and a full-time pilot to do testing. Yeah, as a note, you can read the subtitles there about used in determining the direct pattern of early fishbone antennas. Now, I'll talk a little bit about this guy, Harold Beveridge. Some of you may be familiar with that name, and what a Beveridge antenna is. Yes, he's the guy who created that, and he was an RCA employee, and I actually met him. He lived to over 100 and retired in Stony Brook, not too far from where I grew up. My father knew him, of course. So I'd met him. I've got a signed copy of this book. He did some other interesting antenna. We'll show a little bit more. There was a great deal of antenna work done at the RCA labs on the property that we'll discuss in a little bit. Okay, so you asked about receiving. Yes. So yes, there was a receiving station in Riverhead. Rocky Point was transmit only. As we all know, second bullet, true communication requires the ability to receive unless we're a broadcast station. For reasons which we're all likely very familiar with, you want transmitters and receivers to be isolated and separated. And, again, there were different frequencies used by different stations in this network, but they weren't that far apart. And of course, the selectivity of the receivers in the day were not very good. So somebody determined that they about 17 miles or so between Rocky Point and Riverhead, that was enough. That was enough. And, as I point out here, receiving is more of a finesse art. Riverhead was a dramatically smaller operation. No giant noisy alternators, no, huge power facilities. So it was smaller, quieter, and didn't get the attention that Rocky Point did. But, Rocky Point without Riverhead would be the sound of one hand clapping, as they say. And again, all the recovered CW went straight to the city, just like Rocky Point pulled all the content from Manhattan. The initial antenna, just some simple wire, 30-foot high, but 9 miles long. There's some funny stories about towards the end, when Rocky Point and Riverhead together were winding down, RCA had purchased a very narrow plot of property that literally cut Long Island in half. Most of it just kind of was abandoned and they lost track of it. But he said every once in a while, even into the 70s, he'd get a tax bill for a piece of property that was 3 miles long and 8 feet wide. And they would just abandon the stuff, and I guess it became property of whatever the government jurisdiction was in that area. Also mentioned the wave antenna or beverage antenna was developed by RCA engineer Dr. Harold Beveridge. I couldn't find the patent. I'll just mention it now. Again, there was a lot of important antenna work done at Rocky Point, not specifically related to the communications that went there, but there was a labs building. And it's worth noting that, for example, all the initial television antennas that went on the Empire State Building were all tested and developed at RCA Rocky Point. There are numerous patents, if you go back and look on that technology, with names of folks who are at Rocky Point and addresses of Port Jefferson and so forth. In fact, the one funny story I stumbled upon, again, running the patent committee at Zebra for our piece of the business. We deal with a lot of antenna patents. And somebody once asked me, because we reject a lot of patents also, can you give us a good example of an antenna patent? So I started poking around and I accidentally discovered that the very first mention of the traditional 300 ohm folded dipole was a patent by a fellow that worked at Rocky Point. Obviously, it's long since expired, but having a dipole that could easily was impedance matched to traditional balanced line was really useful. And that I forgot the guy, was Phillips, guy who invented that. It's an interesting one to chase down. So just like the main RCA site is now a New York State preserve, so is the Riverhead property. I think I've got some images of, here. I mean, here's some interesting images of that was the first building that was put up at Riverhead. A little bit of a letdown from Rocky Point. Could be somebody's little Cape Cod style house. And it was just, it was a room full of receivers. I think they were all just synchronously tuned, what's called tuned RF receivers. I don't know a great deal about the details of how they did the receiving. This was clearly before Superhet, but again, we're talking about receiving signals that are already, down in the near audible range. So you don't need a great deal of sophistication at those frequencies. Just a couple of nicely synchronously tuned LC filters and some, I don't know what they used for diode detectors and so forth. And that would do the trick. But I'm sure it was stone quiet. You probably just heard some relays clicking away as the CW came in. Just a shot of some receiving equipment. Again, nothing super impressive, but very, very necessary. Now, sometimes you find things that are a mistake. And I included this one because I don't believe they had even considered shortwave in 1921. Maybe not just yet. Soon, but not yet. But this is where this shows some of the patch panel work. You know, it again very much like a telephone switchboard, right? You had to route what was coming in off all those receivers. You had to route it to lines that went into the city. So you got a patch panel, a whole bunch of spare patch cords. And I guess these were monitoring signals and such, but that's how they did it. There's some similar shots you'll see of you know, the reverse happening at Rocky Point. All right, let's switch now. I mentioned this to a few folks the other day. There was a whole network. They weren't all owned by RCA, but there was roughly a dozen stations, all based on the same essential design. As noted, they weren't all owned by RCA, but they were all part of a common network that would send and receive messages to each other. This one in Sweden, or more specifically Grimeton, Sweden, is special. It's a UN World Heritage Site, and it remains functional and operational to this day. This is what it looks like. And if you blinked real quick, you'd say, hey, that looks like Rocky Point. And while I don't know that they worked from the exact same plans, the sense is that they were, you know, they're all based on a common theme. In fact, it's worth mentioning there's I forget what channel it's on. There's a show called Mysteries of the Abandoned. I think it's on Science Channel or something like that. There was a sister station to Rocky Point in Bolinas, California, north of San Francisco. It looks an awful lot like this too. It's completely run down, but at least unlike Rocky Point, it hasn't yet been plowed under. So if you see the one on, I think it's Mysteries of the Abandoned, about the station in Bolinas, they got the technical part of it all wrong, but so be it. You get an interesting shot of the building. Okay. This is just from the website for Grimeton. If you just Google Grimeton site, there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff. And again, same guy, Ernst Alexanderson. Now, of course, he's one of the reasons this station is still there is this guy, Ernst Alexanderson, is Swedish. Although when RCA Rocky Point was being developed, he was working for, I think, GE in upstate New York. So while he was Swedish, most of the work that he did on these concepts was done in the U.S. This gives you a little bit of information about, you know, the establishment of the station. So it was a little bit after Rocky Point. I'm pretty sure Rocky Point was the first one in the network. You know, again, notice this constant of six towers about the same height, the cross arms. I think the intervals were about the same. The cross arms are the same. And oh, here's what's interesting. Going back to the mystery of the radiating vertical elements. And this is not my wording, but this confirms the analysis. There was 6 vertical radiating elements. So that kind of confirms what was in the patent is accurate. I guess they went on the air in 1924. The station's called SAQ. And again, they're at even slightly lower frequency. Most of the stuff at Rocky Point was around 18 kilohertz. They're at 16 kilohertz. And as note, I think I put this in there, the wavelength, if you do the math here, they're nowhere near even a half wavelength antennas. And I guess they changed their frequency at one point to the really, really high frequency of 17 kilohertz. Let me see if I have anything else about Grimeton. This is what it looks like today. So I guess it's sort of a shame that Rocky Point wasn't preserved. It would have looked a lot like this. Oh well, say la vie. What's really impressive is they get on the air every year and transmit, and just like people do with PSK and other modes, people log having heard and recorded, copied the signal. It's on my list of things to do, to try and receive the signal. So, despite it being a very low frequency, there's no substitute for heavy power. So I guess when you can pump 200 kilowatts into the ether, it gets around the world. And that was one of the attractions of this very, low frequency transmission mode. It was kind of brute force. It wasn't very efficient, but it was apparently very reliable. There was essentially no impact of sunspots, no ionospheric interaction. But again, go to the website. What's really great, I think it's on YouTube or whatever, it might be accessible through the site. There's some videos of them operating the station. And what's shocking, not that it all still works, it's very quiet. There's really, I was expecting a raucous noise from the thing. There are people just talking in the station while the thing's running. It's very, very quiet. Okay, some other interesting items. Marconi Shack. This is allegedly, well, if you follow the history, this was a shack used by Marconi, I think, down in Babylon for some of his early testing. It's been moved a couple of times, but this is supposedly when it was removed from its original site. I guess everyone recognized, even in the early days in 1930, that this thing had some historical significance. It ended up, the story is this: Edwin Armstrong, inventor of FM, purchased the Marconi Shack. He was a collector of memorabilia. He didn't know where to put it, but it was in Babylon, and he knew RCA had a big facility in Rocky Point with lots of property. He knew Sarnoff, who was the head of RCA. He asked RCA if they would hold on to it for a while. Well, for a while turned into from 1930 to sometime in the 70s. Eventually, it made its way in front of the Rocky Point High School, and I'll explain a little bit about how that happened, but it spent most of its life sitting next to, this is the side of the main building at Rocky Point. And these two guys are probably some of the biggest names in radio history that you'd ever come across. Marconi. Marconi is the guy on this side. Sarnoff is this guy. Sarnoff is essentially the founder and first president of RCA. His other claim to fame, Sarnoff was a radio operator. He was supposedly the guy that copied the emergency messages from the Titanic. You'll have to check that yourself. This was it sitting next to the building, Rocky Point, main building. You can see the tower. The funny thing is, this was my father's office, these two windows here. So at some point, he said, it shouldn't sit here turning to dust at Rocky Point. And like I said, it eventually, there were some negotiations about who wanted it. I think the Knights of Columbus wanted it. A few other people wanted it, but ultimately it ended up with the Rocky Point Historical Society. Rocky Point Historical Society, working with the local school district, acquired it. And various radio events take place from the shack every year. I think the Radio Central Club, hope I have that right, does a Marconi Day from the Marconi Shack, puts it on the air. Okay. Yeah, now this is again Armstrong. Marconi and Armstrong. Armstrong, I said, was the inventor of FM. So again, you got some pretty notable people in the tech field pictured in front of this little shack. So there's a lot of history there. Another picture of Marconi and Sarnoff, I guess, inside the building at Rocky Point. Now this is interesting. Shortwave. So RCA Rocky Point was built for this grandiose long wave 200 kilowatt concept. And as noted here, Harold Beveridge commented, I think this was in his book, just a few years after construction began, it was learned that shortwave transmitters could span international distances at a fraction of the power and cost of the long-wave alternator transmitters. In a 1968 interview, RCA engineer Harold Beveridge remembered in 1926, just 5 years after it opened, tests which showed that a small shortwave transmitter using just a 25-foot, 8-meter-long antenna could more readily be heard in South America than the 200 kilowatt alternator long-wave transmission. So the end, as I said, the concrete was barely dry. And it was kind of, well, maybe we don't need 200 kilowatts and miles of antennas. And that's, this is a view of the building. But what you're starting to see early on is all of these telephone poles. And I'll show some later pictures of this, but this is all of the shortwave stuff. So slowly over time, actually maybe not so slowly, they began to supplement the long wave stuff with shortwave. It was just, it was more efficient. They needed to pump more signals through this place. They needed to get the cost per bit down. And shortwave was the answer. This is just one of the other buildings. As they expanded, they put a lot of transmitters. You'll see. I'll show some more details on a few slides about all the transmitters that went in the main building, shortwave transmitters. But as you get further and further from the main building, you start to incur losses. It gets unwieldy to run super long transmission lines. So quite a distance north of the main building, they built a second transmitter building called building 9. Looked like, again, a miniature version of the main building that housed even more transmitters. Now this is an interesting chart. So I don't know the exact date of this, but this kind of gives you an idea of, I think at peak, I think this is the main building, and that's the building 9. This was all the active transmitters in that main building, and what frequency range they could cover, what types of modulation, and transmit power. So they were not shy about solving propagation issues with extreme power. I do recall being in the building, and it was all, even inside the building, it was open transmission line. And one of the favorite demos when people went out there was to take a fluorescent tube and just stick it up in the air inside the main building, and it would light up if you got anywhere near any of the transmission lines. What was more noteworthy, or more frightening perhaps, was I wasn't there when this happened, but my father used to say when there was lightning storms, not unusual for lightning to propagate down one of the transmission lines and into the building, which would get everyone's attention. Then a word about some of the transmission here. Most of it at this point in time was FSK. So, and by FSK, we mean RTTY, RTTY. There was really not, and some phone, but most of the traffic was now radio teletype, which was part of the RCA telex network. I trust everyone has some familiarity with what telex is. It was a pay-for service to send typewritten messages around the world, essentially instantly. And that's how RTTY got its start. It was a commercial service, based on FSK data. And businesses had telex numbers. You'd press the start button on your telex machine at your office. You'd get a RCA GA if it was an RCA machine, which meant RCA go ahead. You'd enter what we'll call a phone number, a telex number of a destination machine. You'd get back another printed message telling you the machine was ready, and you start typing your message. When you're done, you disconnect. A lot of international business was conducted that way over RCA's network, ITT, and Western Union. By the way, each of those other providers have radio facilities on Long Island. The Hauppauge Industrial Park, as we know it today, was that was ITT radio. I think, I'm not exactly sure where Western Union was. They might have been in Sayville. But basically, all the big three all had radio operations on Long Island. But you can read it again. Mostly, by the time when I used to go out there, it was mostly FSK stuff, and that kind of inspired me. One of my early ham activities was getting a Model 15 teletype on the air, because I had free access to Model 15 teletype machines.
I got a comment.
Sorry, sure.
When I went to work for a company out in Hauppauge in 1985 on Adams Avenue, it wasn't even developed yet.
Yeah.
My original job was when I was high school, was working for a steamship company, doing telex.
Yep.
So I knew IT&T and RCA, and whenever we would send to a ship out in the Mediterranean on the Atlantic, we'd have to go to RTA McKay Marine Radio.
Yep.
When I went to work in '85, there was the RCA McKay Marine Radio shack. They were tearing it down along with the telephone poles.
Yeah.
It was on Adams Avenue, and another street yet to be named now,
Right.
Wireless Boulevard.
Yeah. The interesting thing is I ended up working, I don't want to segue too much, but I ended up working for a company in the Hauppauge Industrial Park called Coherent Communications. As telex continues to evolve, even after it went terrestrial, there was two companies doing multiplexing equipment for telex. One was frequency division multiplexing. That was Coherent Communications, where they put 24 telex channels on a 4-wire voice circuit, spread out spectrally. Not unlike what we do today with PSK. And then Databit, I don't know if you've Long Islanders, maybe familiar with Databit. Databit was doing digital multiplexing. A single modem carrier with digital multiplexing of up to, I think it's the same 24 telex, 75 baud or 50 baud telex links. So I actually ended up developing and selling some telex modems later on. But at this point in time, though, it was one telex channel per transmitter, except I had to look this up. There's some of the stuff is labeled ISB, and that's individual sideband. That's a single transmitter that is both simultaneously upper and lower sideband with different signals on the upper and lower sidebands. It's kind of a 2-channel multiplexer. But you can see there was a lot of RF floating around out there.
This is George, KD2FRU.
Hey, how you doing?
Okay, I didn't hear you mention where AT&T falls in, because they were actually the developers of the original signaling concept. They were actually the developers of a lot of stuff that you're talking about. And I'm listening to how this all falls in to radio towers and people that were developers. I'm not sure where this falls in, because a lot of this stuff was developed in the 1920s and the 1930s by AT&T Bell Labs.
Well, I know AT&T was largely responsible for all the telephone network stuff.
I know that. I know that. Telephone is telephone. They were also responsible for digital data communications. They were also responsible for radio tower communications and all cable communications as we know it and has passed. It's left us. It went to fiber optics. It went to, of course, digital mobile phone as we know it. But you never mentioned them in there because they were the leader in all of this.
I would disagree. I mean, I know they were.
I can't disagree with that. No. I worked for AT&T Laboratories.
I mean, I know AT&T did some, if you talk about the telephone network signaling and all that stuff, they owned it all soup to nuts.
No, I'm not just talking about telephone network signaling. I'm talking about the entire transmission form itself.
When you say transmission,
As we understand it, who was the leader in RF? Who was the leader in RF HF transmission? You mentioned earlier, I couldn't get in. You were talking about big arrays of antennas, Sturba arrays, developed by AT&T Laboratories for HF, long distance communications. And there was a lot of stuff you mentioned here that you attributed to a lot of companies that were not really involved. They were preceded by AT&T's developments.
such as what aspects of this did they develop? I'm
talking about HF communications in the 1920s with Sturba arrays. I mentioned that almost an hour ago.
It's possible.
Yeah. Excuse me here. Hey,
Sorry?
George, could we take this one offline and let Dave finish? It's really interesting, but this is sort of a sidebar discussion. And
You got me really interested. I'd love to explore that more.
yeah, exactly. Dave, if you could
Sure. I don't have
continue, appreciate
too
it. Thank
much
you.
more to go here.
And
You know-
sorry, George, I don't mean to cut you off, but we gotta move along. Thanks.
I would be shoot me an email. I'd love to have a private. I'd love to dig into that. I'm just Lundquist at IEEE.org. I'd love to dig into that a little further.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for your time. KD2FIU. Yeah, my pleasure also. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right. I don't have too much more to go here. This is kind of just a good shot of the, in the later years, I guess, before they took down the cross arms on the one remaining tower. I got a few shots of, this has got to be, judging by the cars you'll see in the next picture or two, this is how I sort of remember Rocky Point. And this has got to be in the late 60s, early 70s. Again, taken from the one remaining transmitter. But you can see all these poles out here. That this is all framework. You can't see them, but there's just a forest of balanced twin lead transmission lines coming out of the building on either end. Of course, by this time they really weren't using the cooling ponds; they just kind of sat there. This is the other side of the building. Again, you could see all these telephone poles and cross arms with all the white insulators. This is it's hard to walk through the property without finding at least a couple of these white insulators that they suspended the copper transmission lines from. The antennas, by the way, I don't know if I've got too much information on this. Virtually all the HF stuff was using rhombic antennas. They're directional. They're not, you can't really easily rotate them. The big advantage they have is their broadband. It's a traveling wave antenna. It's not a resonant antenna. And they tended to use nothing but rhombics. So the back of the building, again, you could see, again, the building was like a porcupine with all all the transmission line stuff coming out of the building. You can see each one of these pairs of white insulators was supporting a balanced transmission line that went to some distant rhombic antenna pointed at some distant city. This is the actual, well, this is the base of the last tower that got taken down in 77, I believe. This little building that they built, this is sort of the irony, this was the microwave shack. So at some point they supplemented the backhaul to the city with microwave and put the microwave antennas on that same tower. This is one of the transmitters that was mentioned in that list. Now this, speaking of who did what, RCA did develop at their own facilities, their own HF transmitters. So this was an RCA I think a T3 transmitter, built, I won't say from scratch, but built for their own use. And they've got a receiver sitting there and I guess a spectrum analyzer just to keep things, make sure things are clean. This is what the interior of the building looked like. Look inside the side. It was a long open hallway. Again, just row of transmitter after transmitter. Everybody knows what these sticks are, right? Before you put your fingers in the transmitter, you ground everything. So the stick was it had a heavy cable to ground. So that was your ground stick. I don't think they lost anybody out there. Scare the devil out of me though. There's just some notes on some of the history of the area. I won't go into too much detail about this. There's an interesting shot. This was the control room upstairs at Rocky Point. As we noted earlier, everything came out from the city. So this was their equivalent to that earlier patch panel we saw at Riverhead. These are the Model 15 teletypes. And they would periodically, monitor traffic. Somebody said there's a problem. They'd tap in and listen. You got some receivers here, guys, checking things. So just constantly, there was always at least one person on site in that room, making sure everything was okay. This guy was named Lowell Fletcher. I met him. He was actually a PhD who just decided he'd rather work at Rocky Point than do anything else. That's a view from way up the tower. I could not imagine climbing that. Again, you can see all the transmission line stuff. This is my father in front of the building. He must have had some visitor or something at some point. Again, RCA had stations all over the world. So anytime anybody came to New York to visit, they wanted to go see RCA Rocky Point. So there was a lot of tour activities. Must have been around, well, we moved to the area in 67 and we replaced this vehicle in 68. So it had to be 67. Again, there's the single remaining tower still there with no cross arms. Okay, this is just a screen. This is a shot just before the 100th anniversary. There was a sign put up in front of the entrance to building 1, main building on Rocky Point Road. This sign, hopefully it's still there today as we speak, commemorates what happened there, along with the IEEE plaque at the Rocky Point High School. And I think this is just a map of the property. It's very hard to see this. I'll make these slides available if somebody wants to, to browse through it. I've got plenty of other pictures that go, it gets a bit redundant after a while. This was a list of the different buildings. The only thing I'll mention is there were labs on site. So there was, I mentioned that was, it's a little hard to tell. I don't know if you know Rocky Point Road. It goes down, yeah, here's Rocky Point Road. Down at the south end of the property, almost to Whiskey Road. There was a cluster of buildings called the Lab. And this is where they did a fairly good sized team of folks doing just basic, they did a lot of antenna research. They did a lot of,
Dave?
sorry?
Dave, just a quick question here. Was any ham radio activity done here at Rocky Point?
Officially or unofficially?
Oh, I think it would be a G job, but I guess
Yes,
unofficially would be the best word. And
what-
also,
what
we're kind of approaching a time deadline here.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good. I think we're just about
Okay.
done. Yeah, it was known that, well, virtually everybody that worked there who was, like one of the technicians, they were almost all hams. Every single one of them. Now, what happens with an unused transmitter that's 20 kilowatts and a rhombic at during off hours? They were doing, and I'm using air quotes here, testing. So yeah, there was that happened occasionally. The big problem was the transmit receive problem. With that many transmitters running in the building at once, desense was horrendous. So you could get out amazingly well, but what do you do about receiving in a building with 30 or 40, 50, 20 kilowatt transmitters running? But yeah, it was known that they did, for sure. All right.
Sounds great. Dave, thank
I
you very
think-
much.
I think that's a picture of the tower the day it came down. I was there. Just very quickly, the property was transferred to the state in '78. That's my father again. So one of the things I was, in retrospect, very glad to see, my father lobbied pretty strongly that RCA donate the property to the state. There was talk about turning it into a big housing development, a university, whatever, but he played a role in making sure it's forever preserved. And that's it.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Dave.
My pleasure. We're out of time. I'll just mention there's a couple of videos on YouTube. If you just Google RCA Rocky Point, or you just go to YouTube and search on RCA Rocky Point.
Yeah.
There's a video of all the news feeds from the day the tower came down. There's an interviews with some of the guys, my father included, about operations there.
Yeah.
And
Dave, if you have any of those, could you send them to me as a link, and we'll make sure it gets posted.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That'll work great. But thank you very much. This was absolutely fascinating. We
Okay.
really appreciate it.
And when I get corrected on AT&T, we'll follow up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I forget the gentleman's name who mentioned that, but by all means, shoot me an email. I'd love to chat with you some night.
Great. Thank
Good.
you.
All right. I'm gonna stop sharing.
All right, Gary, we need a random digit generator between numbers 1 and 15. Three people, three numbers between 1 and
Okay.
15.
Hang on, let me stop the recording first.